we could see 2,800 before the end of the month.
I know, but it seems absurd, Tom.
Fundstrat's Tom Lee thinks there are more gains ahead. The firm just raised its S&P 500 year-end target to 4,800.
Fundstrat is out with its 2022 market outlook. The forecast calls for new highs, but it may not be smooth sailing. Ultimately, you're calling for a pretty good year next year, 11% or so, but all the gains are going to be in the back half. What happens in the first half?
Equity investors scurried for the sidelines after several tech
All right, Tom, you are dialed in, and don't worry, I won't ask anything too political.
I trust you. The fatal last words.
All right, let's get started. Welcome to our first ever FS Insight YouTube live stream event. Before we get started, if you are new to FS Insight, we are an evidence-based research firm co-founded by Tom Lee, who is a regular contributor to CNBC. You may have seen him on television, and he's also the former chief equity strategist at JPMorgan Chase. Fundstrat research has been delivered to institutional investors for years, including banks and hedge funds. And just recently, in the last several years, we've launched FS Insight, providing research to retail investors. So investment advisors and individuals like you and I can now access the same information. You can always try FS Insight for free for 30 days on us. Access all of our research, stock list, technicals, crypto insights, so much more. We'll make sure to leave the link down below. And if you're not ready, that's totally fine too. In the meantime, definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel. We want to do more of these live stream events for everyone, and also follow us on socials. We'll have all of that linked below. So we are so glad you're here. Today, we are discussing U.S. policy with Tom Block. He is FS Insight's Washington Policy Strategist. Tom Block spent over 20 years at JPMorgan Chase as the global head of government relations. And he also worked in Washington, D.C., running both congressmen and senators' offices. So not only does Tom Block have decades of experience, but he has continued connections, and he provides insight to our team every week, demystifying all of the political headlines and giving us the scoop. So Tom, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We have a lot to cover. So I'd like to start by giving our audience a snapshot of where we are in DC right now, as you noted in this week's U.S. policy report.
So I think the big issue, the Senate comes back next week. I think the big issue is going to be they have one must-pass bill, which is the continuing resolution, which, as it implies, it continues spending at the current year's level. And the government cannot operate after October 1st if there's not some bare bones, simple CR that passes to keep the government running. Many of us remember different scary times when we had semi-government shutdowns because Congress had not acted in a timely fashion. So they must act by October 1st. And they have the ability to make different changes in government. It's the Senate, the House has rules of germaneness, which means you can't put anything in a bill that's not related to the central issue of the bill. But the CR is unique in that the entire government is in one bill. So they can put anything in the bill. So that is always a danger point. Having worked in Washington, having worked on Capitol Hill, these are very dangerous moments for staff members because your member can come up with any idea and put it in the bill. So that's the issue. I think I'm concerned from markets perspective for headline risk over the next 2 weeks as reporters start to talk about, could there be a government shutdown? And there obviously always could be a government shutdown, but we know it's always a Chicken Little thing and that they know they have to pass the bill and the government goes down for a day or so. But I think both parties are really committed to avoiding a government shutdown. Just weeks before the next election, they don't want to be blamed, and they just don't know who the public will blame for a government shutdown. The issue that, as I talk to people in D.C., that could hang it up is that as they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, Senator Manchin of West Virginia was the key person. He was promised by Pelosi, by Schumer, and by the president a vote on a proposal he has to expedite the approval process of energy projects. And actually, there are some environmentalists who support parts of this because it's a very cumbersome approval process to get solar panel fields and wind energy going. So there could be some unexpected support for this, but it is the issue that I and the people I talk to in Washington are really watching. How does the leadership handle the promise to Joe Manchin, and how do they keep House progressive Democrats on board to get this thing done?
I'm going to go ahead and segue over to this topic since you brought it up. But the Inflation Reduction Act, like anything, the headlines are everywhere. And when you try to search and unpack what's inside of it, it's overwhelming. So are there any just key things that we need to keep in mind, or things that you're watching?
Think, a lot of it is perspective. For instance, from a markets for following companies, there's 15% minimum tax but it only affects. I read one study that said it only affects 150 companies in the entire American economy. And secondly, I worked for a very big company that would be subject to this. And these very big companies spend a lot of money and get really competent people to run their tax management departments. So that they are going to devote a lot of resources to gaming the system, for lack of a better term. I remember I talked to one of my CEOs, and we had a meeting with my CEO and the head of tax, and they basically major corporations view paying taxes as a cost of doing business. And just like they decide how many people they're going to hire, where their plants are going to be, they make decisions about what their taxes are going to be. And so these are very well-run companies, very sophisticated tax managers. And then the other interesting part of it is Congress is on both sides of the issue. So the Inflation Reduction Act, yes, had this minimum tax, but they also had new tax provisions that they want them to use to build more energy-efficient plants, to create more manufacturing jobs. And there is language in there that is going to have to be interpreted in the rulemaking process of how there's an exemption from even the minimum tax if you use these targeted high priority areas. So I don't think anybody is writing their check yet at the 15% level. I think it's going to be an active period of rulemaking as the new 15% minimum tax is actually implemented. The other thing that is I think could have helped seniors and help the economy is this 2,000 limit on the amount of prescription drug expense that seniors will have, that Medicare recipients will have. And then, of course, the other thing that the pharmaceutical industry has fought so hard is this idea of letting the government negotiate their prices under Medicare. It doesn't start till 1926. It's only 10 drugs a year. And again, I think these drug companies are ready to manage this process as they manage other business risks.
It's a really good point. And I have to say, they chose pretty nice name, Inflation Reduction Act. Right. It does make us feel like they're doing something. So it did
stop me for a minute because my friends in Washington immediately picked up the shorthand and started calling it the IRA. Yes. And I thought, wait a second, what am I missing here? And
I did the same. I was writing it out and I thought, oh, I'll just use the acronym. And I thought, well, yeah, I don't think I'll use that one.
It took me a second to realize that they weren't talking about my individual retirement account.
Tom Lee has outlined 7 principles to evidence-based research. If you haven't checked it out, we'll link it in the description below, and everything else that we're mentioning as well. We'll make sure and include the links. But number 7 is don't fight the Fed. And it's so imperative that Tom Lee actually adds an 8th to the 7 principles, pointing back to number 7. So don't fight the Fed. So let's chat about the Fed. In yesterday's internal huddle meeting post Powell's speech, you made a really great observation from that speech. There's not a whole lot to glean from it, but maybe you could just share with our viewers kind of that observation.
Well, I think that, so I've known Jay Powell since we worked on a project when he was the Treasury Department and I was representing the banking industry. He's a very smart guy, and I think that came out, which I think is always good to have a really smart guy as head of the central bank. But I think he wanted to make the point that we are going to be serious about inflation. We have to make the good news is that we don't have the inflation mentality that people had in the 70s and 80s, that they had to buy things now because prices were surely going up. He wants to make sure that kind of mentality doesn't rear its ugly head. And he's going to do that by being tough on rates in the foreseeable future. So I'd be really surprised if it's not a 75 basis point increase at the September meeting. And I think he wants people to think that. I think Jay has done a really good job of telegraphing policy. I think the different Fed chairmen have different policies. Do they want to surprise markets or do they want to telegraph policy? I think Jay has very deliberately taken the policy that I'm going to telegraph policy. And you'd have to be just not listening to think that that the Fed is not going to continue increasing. And I think one of the messages that I take from it is even when they stop, the decline in interest rates will be slow in coming, and maybe slower than some market participants anticipate. But I think he was burnt on the speed of which inflation came. I think he thought that, and I think that he still believes, and I think there's some truth to it, that there's some transitory nature to this inflation. But he overestimated that, and I think he's being careful about it. And I think he's being very straightforward. They're going to keep interest rate at an elevated level until inflation is down to around the 2% level. And you can not believe him, but I think you do that at your own risk and your own peril. And I think that's the message of Jackson Hole, and that's the message of Cato. One other point that I will make is that Cato is sort of is a very conservative Milton Friedman heritage economic shop. So they pushed him about should you not even consider employment, which is part of their dual mandate. And he pushed back on that. He said, no, he thought the dual mandate was very good. So they are Fed skeptics at times, and even they did not raise the issue of recession. So I thought that was interesting, that even a more skeptical Fed skeptical organization like Cato, even they could not make the argument today, don't you have to act because we're in a recession? So I thought that was, again, maybe a trivial point, but I thought it was the lack of that question being raised by Cato was interesting. But overall, I think the bottom line is we're going to see an increase. Just for the people who are watching, there is no October meeting. The next meeting is November. Interestingly, it's days before the midterm elections, and I don't know to what extent. Jay, at his Cato presentation, said we do not view politics, but I was surprised that there's going to be a meeting just days before the midterms.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just to circle back on your mention of just historical context of inflation, is you gave a really great compare and contrast between Powell and Volcker during our roundtable, and again mentioned that there was much more of a broadcast with Powell. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see that we're still seeing that months later.
Yeah. So I think that's a deliberate decision that Chair Powell has made.
Yeah. And so I guess we can dive into midterms. So several days before is the next Fed meeting, apparently. And I know politics doesn't really play into this, according to Powell's speech yesterday. But can you speak to any, to the election and how the Fed and inflation may play into midterms, if at all?
So I think, when I was at the last few years when I was working with Tom Lee at JPM, I was working with the economics department, and I would always say they would always make the point they were all, except for me, they were all highly trained economists, and I was the macro guy, and I would say they may not take their positions based on politics, but they are not blind to politics. So Jay Powell in his presentation today said that they are accountable to Congress, but they don't take politics, day-to-day politics, in consideration in fulfilling their dual mandate of inflation and employment. So I think inflation is obviously on voters' minds. Historically, since I wrote on my weekly report, I gave a chart that showed since the American Civil War to today, there have only been 4 occasions where there's been a mid-year election where the party that controls the White House did not lose seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. So history is not on the Democratic side, and they only have a 5-seat majority. So even if the Republicans don't have a great day on election day and only pick up 10 seats, they still get control of the House. So I think it's not impossible. I would say that a month or two ago, people were saying there was no chance of the Democrats keeping the majority. I now think there's a tiny chance, very technical term, tiny, but I think the odds are overwhelming that the Republicans get control of the House. The Democrats have been heartened by the abortion issue. Again, I'm not political in these presentations, but there was the very surprising vote in Kansas where they had a referendum on abortion and putting it in their constitution, and almost 60% in very Republican Kansas voted not to outlaw abortion in their constitution. There's been some special elections, one on a deeply red Alaska, where a Democrat won their at-large House seat, replacing a Republican. And in upstate New York, there was a very swing district that went for Trump in 2016, barely eked out Biden victory in 2020, and the Democrat held that seat. And again, looking at, it was really the first off-year election of this cycle, and the traditional of the out party in the White House losing the seat, the Republicans thought that could well hold, and the Democrats held the seat. So there's a little bit of optimism, but the historical trend is definitely supports the Republicans. And that Senate, and also one other point is, again, having worked in House races and Senate races, House races tend to be very local. People know who their congressman is. They get lots of local news. They're on the local TV stations. The Senate tends to be more national, and the individuals tend not to have as close a relationship with their senator as they do with their congressman. So the Senate's a little different. Of course, rather than the whole Senate being up, only a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. And so the Senate races look a little more competitive. There are 10 races that I'll be writing about in the coming weeks, that 5 Republican and 5 Senate Democrats, that everybody agrees these are the 10 races to watch. There are several that the Republicans have nominated candidates that even Mitch McConnell said are not as strong as he would like. The Democrats, by and large, have nominated the candidates that they thought were their strongest candidates, and they're doing they seem to be doing pretty well. But they aren't going to run away with it. It's going to be I'm going to be writing about it each week, about the races, and especially these 10 Senate races. And we'll see. I think it could go either way. It could end up still 50-50. It could be 1 seat Republican majority. It could be 1 seat Democratic majority. I don't think anybody's going to really pad their lead in this election cycle.
Tom Block, we are definitely excited about you writing about it. We're just glad that you're not going to be a commercial on our TV that replays over and over for the next 6 weeks. It's that time of year again, right? After summer.
Yeah, it is. And as I wrote, having been in politics and having worked in both a House campaign and a Senate campaign, but the rule of thumb in politics is that voters don't start to focus on the election until after Labor Day. So nobody takes very seriously polling that occurs during the summer. So I hardly look at it because people just haven't thought about who they're going to vote for. They're thinking about what beach they're going to go to and where they're going to take their next picnic, and is a swimming pool open today, and not who am I going to vote for the House, or who am I going to vote for the Senate.
That's a good point. I think every midterm is a little different. There's unique, topics at play. I think this year, like you mentioned, with the Roe v. Wade, we have energy costs, inflation, there's so much. But let's just take that history repeats itself. And this is the 5th time, and the GOP takes the chamber. Do we see Kevin McCarthy as the new Speaker of House, or do you think there are any other Republican members who could give him a run for his money?
I would say it'd be the chances are overwhelming. We always say, what are the odds? And nothing is zero, but I think somebody successfully challenging Kevin McCarthy is very close to zero. I think he will be the Speaker if the Republicans get control of the House. Donald Trump is always the wild card, I guess, if he really went full throttle against Kevin McCarthy. But Kevin McCarthy seems to have been managing pretty well his relationship with the former president. So I think as far as policy goes, there is still going to be the ability to veto a bill. So Joe Biden is going to be president of the United States till January 20th, 2025. And so for these next 2 years, even with a Democratic House, I don't think you'll see major changes in policy. The other important thing to remember is that the deadlock, everybody, when I used to, again, work in politics, people would complain about, Congress isn't doing anything. But then when they do something, they complain about that. So I think there are a lot of people who think deadlock in government is not bad. They can't pass any bad bill if they're deadlocked. And so I have a feeling that this will not drastically change policy. Nothing will be repealed because Biden would veto it. So I don't think I think market participants could overstate what the difference would be of a change in control. And I think that's why the Democrats have been so active in passing all these bills, the infrastructure bill, the IRA bill, the CHIPS bill. Some of them were bipartisan, some of them were not, but they wanted to get them done because there could be more gridlock if the Republicans capture the House this election day.
You're right. I think it's what they say, like, you're darned if you do and darned if you don't kind of thing. Like to keep it clean for our viewers. But yeah, it's pretty much the same idea in DC. So we have kind of a lightning round, which are just a couple of just ideas, thoughts, hot topics to kind of see what you're thinking. All right, this is a leap forward, but since you brought it up, what are the odds we see a Trump-Biden rematch?
I think it's too early to tell. I think that, again, I'm not having been in politics. I think there's a legitimate concern in America, this young relative country, that we have the two leading candidates are both in their late 70s. And so will at some point, there are several people have started to speak. David Gergen, who I respect tremendously, wrote a wonderful op-ed. Is that it's time for the next generation to start leading America. And I don't find that a debatable point. And so we'll see what happens. Every Democrat is saying if Biden wants to run, I'm not going to oppose him. But I think people are talking. I know people are talking about it. They talk to me about it. What are we going to do? And what is Joe going to do? Is what they say. And the same thing really in the Republican Party. I think if Mr. Trump raises his hand and says, I'm running, I think it'd be very difficult to challenge Donald Trump. If he doesn't run, I think actually the Republican Party has a very deep bench from Nikki Haley to Ron DeSantis to they have a lot of candidates who could run. There was an article which reflected what people have talked to me about, that Pete Buttigieg is a very well-spoken possible candidate if Mr. Biden doesn't run. But I think obviously the vice president would be a candidate. So both parties, I think, have a younger group of people who are ready to run, but the old guys have to step aside first.
Those were actually my next questions. If Biden doesn't run, who do you see as a front runner among potential candidates? You already mentioned a couple, but is there anyone that you would say?
I think those are the two I hear about the most. I mean, obviously the vice president would always try to run. When George H.W. Bush ran, everybody talked about how it had been like over 100 years since a vice president had successfully run and succeeded the president. But George H.W. did that successfully, and so it's not a done deal that a vice president gets elected. It's often that they get the nomination. More often that they get the nomination, they get elected. But I think she would obviously be a strong candidate. Pete Buttigieg would be a strong candidate. Whoever heard of Bill Clinton, the governor of an obscure little southern state, until he decided to run such a successful campaign. And until Barack Obama gave his speech, nobody had heard of Barack Obama. So they arose onto the national stage in a very tight time frame. And so the next nominee could be some governor who hasn't gotten national attention that's not on anybody's list right now.
That is very true. That's very true. I look forward to that. I look forward to some fresh faces. And
I think I can be bipartisan about this because both parties have guys who are just too old. I mean, I'm not that far away from either of their age, and I enjoy doing this. I think I do a good job helping fund strat, but I'm not ready to become president of the United States. I think I'm too old, and I think that I just don't think you should be approaching your 80th birthday and being president of the United States. I mean, you look at the new prime minister of England as a younger woman. The leader of France is a young man. I mean, all over Europe, the prime minister of Finland, who was out partying one night and got all sorts of publicity. I mean, we really could use, as David Gergen said, it's time for the next generation of leaders to step up in both parties.
I like it. I vote for you, Tom Block, though, if you want to run. I'll help you with some media. I'll do whatever we can. So I'm going to circle over to the student loan forgiveness. And I'm just going to ask, do you think it's going to hurt or help the Dems in the midterms?
That's a good question. And if I knew the answer, I'd be making more money as a really high-paid political consultant. I think it rubs both ways. I understand and I can appreciate both sides of that coin. And I think time will tell how it's executed. I think there's what the actual dollar level is. I used to, when I worked for companies, I used to say, I described it as 60-minute risk, that there's an issue that gets on 60 Minutes or some other news magazine or the nightly news, and you get caught doing something, and that really can make an issue that wasn't an issue into a major focus of policy. And if you had a segment on one of these news programs about very wealthy person who has no children and drives a Mercedes and gets a student loan, I think that could be a real hit job on the student loan program. But on the other hand, you get people who are, want to go to medical school. They want to make a change in life, in the world. They want to make life better for people, and they're hung up on their student loans, and they just can't make the contribution to society that they could if that is forgiven. So again, I could make a good political commercial for either side of this argument, and I think it's too early to tell.
Yeah, and I don't know if polling has the the grasp that it used to after the last several presidential elections, but it will be interesting to maybe take a look at some of the exit polling after this year's midterms and kind of see
I think the exit polling is good. So again, when I worked in politics, I was really involved in polling. And I think, I won't go into it too detailed, but I think the cell phone has made polling much more difficult, because in the olden days when I did polling, everybody had a landline, and I knew there was a directory that had the phone number and then the address. So when you were putting together polls, you knew exactly where the person lived. So you knew if it was a high net worth income, what the ethnic background of the people who lived in that neighborhood. You could be pretty sure that your model, that the voters you were calling for your model, were the person you wanted in your model. So if you wanted a lower income person, you could find a street where everybody's lower income and be pretty sure you had a lower income. And similar with almost any demographic. And today, I look at myself. I live in I have a home in Kentucky. I vote in Florida, where I also have a home. And if you call me, you're calling a Connecticut area code. So how in the world do you find me? And so I think that is one of the reasons polling has gotten so difficult. I've talked to several pollsters. They tell me different things they're doing to make up for it. I just don't, in the end of the day, I don't think they've really found the way to be as accurate as they were when everybody had a landline.
That's true. I'm so glad we found you. I mean, you're always in a new place, but today I'm glad that you joined us. Yeah. So thank you for your time, Tom Block, and have a wonderful day.
You have a good day too.
It's nice to talk to someone with so much experience in Washington, D.C. that can really demystify a lot of these headlines and risks, and maybe what we should really be paying attention to. And again, if you are new to FS Insight, join us. We have a promotional link below where you can start a 30-day free trial and access all of our research, stock lists, everything that you need to navigate the markets. So check it out. And yeah, we're so glad that you joined us, and make sure you subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop and be notified of any future live streams. So this has been really fun. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Have a great weekend.